Who's in charge in Iran right now? One moment, Iranian officials say the Strait of Hormuz is open. Next moment, it's closed. And now, apparently, it might be opened again. So, is any one central authority making these calls?
The reality is that we can't say for certain, but if we had to take a guess based on reading the tea leaves and the limited evidence we have, it's likely that, broadly speaking, the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, the leading military force in Iran, retains overall control of the system while coordinating governance of the country with different power centers.
All right, that's Farzan Sabet from a think tank in Geneva. He's worked for the United Nations and provides consultation for governments and multinational corporations. You'll hear more from him later. But first, a quick recap. Now, this is what Iran's Foreign Minister Sayed Araghchi posted on X on Friday. We'll bring the post up right there. The passage of commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz was, quote, declared completely open. But then, just a day later, this on Iranian state TV. What you're going to see is a statement being read out attributed to the country's top military command saying that the Strait of Hormuz is closed again due to, quote, breaches of commitment by the United States, unquote. The impact was immediate. We'll show you a time lapse showing traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. We start on the 17th of April, that's a Friday. And you can see a number of ships passing through. But then you see traffic begins to thin out. Over the weekend, that is what happened. And now Reuters news agency is reporting that Iran's ambassador to Moscow, Kazem Jalali, told the Vedomosti newspaper that Iran is ensuring, quote, safety of passage, unquote, through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is where we are. Let's try and get more from Farzan Sabet. He's a managing researcher with the Geneva Graduate Institute and joins me now from Geneva. Farzan, thanks so much for being on. You know, when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, this is something that the world has been watching. The foreign minister of Iran said one thing on Friday, then Iran's top military leadership said another less than 24 hours after that. And now we're hearing from Iran's ambassador to Russia who's saying something else entirely. I'm wondering, therefore, if we know who is making the calls in Iran right now.
Well, the reality is that as much as Iran's system was opaque before the war, it's even more opaque today. So the reality is that we can't say for certain, but if we had to take a guess based on reading the tea leaves and the limited evidence we have, it's likely that, broadly speaking, the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, the leading military force in Iran, retains overall control of the system while coordinating governance of the country with different power centers.
Right. I mean, there's a lot to sort of unpack here. So what you're saying is there a conflict then between Iran's civilian and military leadership? Is there a division there right now?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't strictly divide it between a civilian and military leadership. For example, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, he's both a civilian, technically a civilian figure, leading a officially elected center of power in Iran. But in practice, he's also a very senior veteran of the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps and remains well connected to its kind of to the military networks in the country. That being said, I mean, it's I think it's difficult to explain what some of these discrepancies might be. For example, in terms of the specific question, the item that you highlighted, with the foreign minister saying one thing one day and the kind of military saying one thing the next day, that could just be because of the rapidly changing conditions on the ground, right? The Iranians make a statement, then President Trump takes an action or makes a move, causing a discrepancy. That being said, going back to the start of the war, we have seen some growing divergence. For example, with President Masoud Pezeshkian early in the war,
Mhm.
coming out and making reconciliatory comments regarding attacks on the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, but then being severely criticized and being forced to pull back. Something similar could be happening here with certain power centers advancing a much more conciliatory line and being more in favor of going to negotiation, making concessions, while the IRGC and its broader hardline network being much more favoring resistance and being far less conciliatory.
So the way we need to be reading this and reading the tea leaves, to use what you said earlier, is that the hardliners in Iran, the military in Iran, is basically has an edge over determining the future of Iran.
That's right, absolutely.
Can you talk to us a bit more about the leadership as it exists right now? I mean, Iran is in the middle of a war right now, but there was also the 12-day war last year. Was there a change in the leadership structure that was brought about? How has this evolved over the space of a year?
Mhm. So there wasn't a major necessarily overhaul of leadership after the 12-day war. What happens is that certain key figures who were assassinated during and subsequent to that war were replaced with others. One thing that did happen is that learning from the experience of the war, during which the Israelis managed to kill several senior Iranian security figures in quick succession, the Islamic Republic as a system basically created a chain of succession for key and sensitive political and security positions, so that in the case of future attempts to decapitate Iran's leadership, those positions would be quickly filled. Based on the kind of version account you're looking at, basically there was a chain of succession created, maybe 3 or 5 people deep, so that
Mhm.
even if a figure and their successor were assassinated, there would still be more people who could be promoted up the chain to keep those positions functional and the institutions which they represented going. That being said, since the 12-day war and far larger number of assassinations that have happened, with the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei at the very top being killed, all the way down to much figures much further down the chain. There has been a drastic change in the nature of the system. Um, and just in terms of the figures who are there, and many key positions, including, for example, the Supreme Leader's office being filled with figures who are either equally or more hardline. You also saw something similar in the Supreme National Security Council, where
Mhm.
Ali Larijani, who was considered a somewhat more pragmatic figure, being assassinated and replaced with Mohammad Bagher Zolgat, a veteran of the IRGC, who's known to be quite a hardline figure.
Okay, there's so many questions I have based on the very extensive
Of
explanation you
course.
just provided there. Let's just pick on one of them. You were talking about having figures appointed who are 3 to 5 figures deep. But is this working in a siloed structure? As in, are we looking at individual silos and depth of leadership therein? And if that is the case, are these silos interacting with each other?
Mhm. That's a good question. We know that this method of replacing leaders has worked in terms of more or less keeping those whatever power center or whatever structures continuing to operate. But it's very likely that coordination has broken down, partially because as you replace figures, you lose maybe some of the depth of the networks and the relationships, and those have to be reestablished. And of course, there's the wartime conditions, right? For example, in terms of the IRGC's aerospace force, as senior figures are kind of killed, or actually even across other kind of sensitive positions as well, they're replaced. But in terms of maintaining operational security, so that the new figure or the new leadership is not killed, and there aren't further kind of successful strikes, they have to probably minimize communication and coordination. I
Uh-huh.
think this probably leads to some breakdown in coordination across different, power centers, structures, and entities in the state.
Try and help us understand the various, I don't know, is it concentric rings or is it different levels of this leadership structure? So to the outside world, we hear a statement, for example, from the Iranian foreign ministry, and that to the outside world is representative of the Iranian government. Then we also hear something from
Mhm.
the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee. We also hear something from the
Mhm.
National Security Council, not to mention Iran's top military leadership that coordinates between the army and the IRGC. My head is spinning as to which is the authoritative body here that one needs to be looking at.
Mhm. In some cases, there may not necessarily be an authoritative body. Hypothetically, the foreign ministry and the foreign minister and the spokesperson for the foreign ministry are the authoritative voice. In practice, what these different power centers are doing is communicating to different audiences, right?
Okay.
So, for example, you might have the foreign minister saying something which is intended to communicate more to foreign audiences, including, for example, the president of the United States and the United States in general. Whereas the IRGC, for example, in raising rhetoric around the Strait of Hormuz, or in regards to tensions with the U.S., might be focusing on, for example, scaring global markets, scaring off global shipping, or being focused on communicating to the hardline social base of the Islamic Republic regime. So sometimes it's hard to tell which is the authoritative kind of voice. It's sometimes contextual. In some contexts, one might be more authoritative and one less. But oftentimes, they're really speaking to different audiences with different objectives.
Okay, I'll come back to this in a moment because I wanted to ask you about, speaking of line of succession, the Supreme Leader was killed on the first day of these joint US-Israeli strikes on Iran, and then you had Mojtaba Khamenei, who was appointed, but he has been conspicuously absent from the public eye, internationally at least. I mean, we haven't really seen him on networks. We've heard apparently statements from him that have been read out by Iranian state television. Why has Mojtaba Khamenei been conspicuous by his absence? Is there any weight to the reports, call them rumors, what you like, about him potentially being injured, or is it just a security protocol that Iran is following right now? Talk to us a bit about Mojtaba Khamenei.
You're absolutely right that he has been conspicuously absent. One reason is obviously has to do with security. To the extent that he's more active in communicating with the outside world, it makes him a potentially easier target for Israel or the United States to assassinate. But even by the standards of wartime conditions, for example, during the 12-day war, I would have expected to have seen a video, an audio, more audio,
Mhm.
or a photo, much more coming out from Mojtaba Khamenei, in part to kind of establish his authority and to show some greater presence. I would have certainly expected to see more than the kind of texts that we have seen. This indicates to me that it's also possible that he's injured. For example, there's potentially injuries to his face, which makes it perhaps demoralizing for the hardline social base of the regime, or kind of uh, less, let's say, aesthetically pleasing for him to come out and present himself to the public. And until he's able to gain treatment for those injuries, perhaps he prefers to be shy away from the camera. He was already known to be camera shy before
Mhm.
becoming the Supreme Leader. There was very few kind of photos, videos, audios of him in the past. But it's possible that in his new capacity, where you would expect him to have a much greater public presence,
Mhm.
there's some kind of medical reasoning for it there. It's also possible that he's incapacitated much more than we're being led to believe,
Mhm.
and so he's simply not capable of having a greater presence beyond any kind of aesthetic damage that he's taken as a result of the strikes against Iran's leadership.
You were talking about the social base earlier, the hardline social base of the regime in Iran, and also about the messaging to the Iranian public. Do we know where the Iranian public stands on the war, and particularly this regime, given that we were seeing protests against the regime, very widespread active protests across Iran before this war started? Have a lot of those people converted to support for the regime, given that their country is being bombed? Or where are we with public support?
Of course. So the fact is that because the internet has been shut down, uh, we have even fewer voices coming out from Iran than in the past, and the narrative of what society believes coming out, for example, on social media or in the media, is being much more controlled by the regime. So it's really hard to tell, and there's probably a lot of mis or disinformation out there regarding Iran's public opinion. If I
Mhm.
had to take a stab, based on very limited information, what I would say is that a small minority, maybe 10 to 15%, which is kind of corresponds broadly with the regime's hardline social base,
Mhm.
plus some fellow travelers, remains either supportive or strongly supportive of the regime. There's also probably a very large majority who broadly favors the war in terms of attempting to change the regime.
Right.
And so against the regime and in favor. I would say that the majority is probably ambivalent. That is, they don't like the fact that their country is being attacked, especially to
Mhm.
the extent that it disrupts day-to-day life. I think that's a natural reaction from most people. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they're rallying around the regime simply because even if they supported the regime and they come out of this war, as far as we can see right now, the regime doesn't really have solutions to the fundamental problems of the country, whether
Okay.
that's security, whether that's economic or social or political.
Okay, I want to sort of expand this further and talk about potential negotiations over extending the ceasefire that is supposed to extend till the middle of the week. A short while back, you were talking about these various authoritative bodies that exist in Iran and them addressing different audiences, some internationally, some for the oil market, some for the domestic consumption. I'm just wondering what this means for negotiations going in. I mean, which body is negotiating with the Americans or with the outside world? Is it a hodgepodge network of all these different bodies? Is everybody on the same page?
That's an excellent question. I think that Mohammad Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, broadly remains in charge of the civilian governance, as well as has taken a lead for diplomacy. Now, that doesn't mean that he's necessarily fully in control. What that means is that at the very least, he's coordinating and building consensus across different power centers and political currents in the Islam Republic, and is presenting the authoritative negotiating position of the Islamic Republic to the Americans, whether that's through mediators, whether that's through direct kind of communications, or
Mhm.
whether that's at the negotiating table with Vice President JD Vance. That being said, I somewhat get the sense that it's possible that in the kind of pre-communications leading up to the first round of negotiations,
Mhm.
he might have been promising perhaps more than he could deliver. And when he arrived at the negotiating table and the kind of realities in Tehran hit home, he was able to deliver much less. And so that's led to negotiations not moving forward as fast as the Trump administration would have probably wanted. Something which I think is very telling is that Iran's delegation to the negotiation was quite large beyond the technical personnel you would
Uh-huh.
need to conduct such negotiations. There was a lot of different power centers and political kind of currents represented there. I think part of the reason that the delegation was so large was part of an effort to build consensus and have representation from across the spectrum, so that any deal that was signed would have greater buy-in. That shows to me that Tehran is still trying to figure out that position and land on what their kind of optimal negotiating outcomes are.
The phrase "too many cooks spoiling the broth" comes to mind. But then, just on those
Absolutely.
talks, I mean, like, it so far it doesn't appear that Iran is going to send anybody for these ceasefire talks that are supposed to be held in Pakistan, right? Earlier there was a flat-out denial. Then it appears to be indecision whether Iran is sending somebody or not. So what you're saying, from just based on what you just said, this isn't so much strategy; it is potentially a lack of consensus within the various power centers in Iran, correct?
I think you can say I wouldn't necessarily say a lack of consensus. I think what the way I would frame it is that the consensus that exists in Iran probably does not sufficiently overlap with the U.S. position to unlock a deal. In my view, the U.S. would be happy with two types of outcomes. The first outcome is a let's say a small limited deal, which reopens the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for very few concessions from the U.S. For example, unfreezing of some assets, numbering in the billions of dollars. On the other hand, I think President Trump would also be happy for a comprehensive deal that addresses the broad suite of nuclear missile and proxy issues, and for the Iranian side would unlock broad sanctions relief and potentially normalization with the U.S. So the U.S. could be happy with either of those two. A limited deal that leads to a ceasefire and a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz,
Mhm.
or a comprehensive deal that resolves, broadly speaking, the U.S.-Iran conflict. That's not really the Iranian position. What the Iranians would kind of prefer is a comprehensive minus deal. That is a deal in which they make some concessions on the nuclear issue, but unlock broad sweeping sanctions relief. They believe because they retain effective control of the Strait of Hormuz, they can add that to their leverage in
Mhm.
order to get such a deal. But from what we've seen from the US side, that's not really the US position. So what I would say is that there is kind of a consensus in Tehran,
Okay.
although it's tentative, but it doesn't sufficiently overlap with the US position to unlock a deal and a kind of a conclusion to this conflict.
Do you get a sense that Tehran believes it has the cards?
Yes, I think they believe that they're in a position of strength, and that at the very least, their position could continue to get stronger for a certain short period, but their position much further in the future would not necessarily be better. So I think they believe that if they're going to get a, let's say, that comprehensive less deal, now is the best time to do it, given that they've performed sufficiently well militarily
Mhm.
to sustain the survival of the regime, to cause economic pain to their neighbors, and of course, through the Strait of Hormuz, retain control by retaining control of the Strait of Hormuz, damage broadly the global economy. They think this is probably their maximum point of leverage. They think that they hold the cards to the extent that they're going to be able to continue to resist for some time longer. And so, yeah, if they negotiate a deal, they think they're going to do it from a position of strength, and they're probably being more maximalist than they would otherwise be given this perception of strength.
Okay, let's put you in a position of forecasting, Farzan. Do you think this ceasefire will be extended?
I think it's quite possible that the ceasefire will be extended. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a deal, but I think, especially on the U.S. side, President Trump would like to manage markets, preventing kind of some of the downsides that could come from a reflaring up of the conflict. I think, broadly speaking, GCC allies agree with that position, and they'd like to see if a deal could be unlocked. The other thing is that for the U.S. to strengthen its leverage, it needs to pre-position further military
Excuse me.
assets in the region. My sense is that it's going to take a few more weeks before that pre-positioning of assets is complete. So in the meantime, it makes sense for especially for the U.S. side to continue the ceasefire and see if they can hash out something in negotiations.
We'll leave it there for the moment. Farzan Sabet from the Geneva Graduate Institute think tank. Thanks so much for joining us.